Have you been diagnosed with depression and struggle with sadness?
Maybe you're scared of being criticized.
Loss of interest, aches and pain.
Always thinking something terrible.
Ask your doctor about Effexor XR.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Talk to your doctor about Zoloft.
So talk to your healthcare professional.
Get your doctor today.
Your doctor.
Tell your doctor.
Contact your doctor immediately.
Talk with your doctor.
Over 40 years ago, leading psychiatrists met in Puerto Rico to map out their vision of the future.
We see a developing potential for nearly a total control of human emotional status, mental functioning, and will to act.
Their plan? To create by the year 2000 a range of psychiatric drugs regulating every aspect of human behavior.
I was diagnosed with depression and put on Paxil.
ADD, and I was prescribed Ritalin.
General anxiety disorder, prescribed Zoloft.
Bipolar disorder, and I take lithium.
PTSD, Zoloft.
I was on Paxil.
When they placed me on Zoloft.
They gave me Adderall.
I was prescribed Siptamu,
Tegretol,
Lexapro, Depakote,
Stelazine,
Adderall,
Concerta, Orzine,
Prozac,
Lorazepam,
Effexor,
Clonazepam,
Ritalin,
dexamphetamine,
Paxil,
Silert,
Prozac,
Adderall,
Elavil,
Depakote, Wellbutrin, Seroquel, etc., etc.
100 million people worldwide are on psychiatric drugs. How did this happen? Psychiatrists convinced them they were sick.
They want you to think you're diseased from birth, and that all those experiences of life, childhood and adolescence and teenage years and adulthood and being a senior citizen, that these are all various stages of disease.
Because let's face it, we've all been depressed at one time. We've all been anxious at one time. These are normal emotions that we feel.
Every emotional and spiritual problem is reduced to a label.
And of course, all of those diseases require pharmaceutical treatments. This is big, big business.
While generating a healthy income, claiming to be medical professionals, psychiatrists will freely confess that their profession is devoid of science.
Well, you don't really have any specific blood tests or other tests that are definitive for any mental illness whatsoever.
It would be neat if it would become much more scientific.
Well, if you go to my office and you tell me that you're depressed, there's nothing, and no blood sample, whatever, no tests.
There are not current available tests to verify your diagnosis.
I don't use any tests.
You do not have a test to say, well, this is this disorder and this is the best medication for this disorder.
For many years we thought we had the tests nailed down, but it turned out that they weren't of any value.
If you don't know what's causing the symptoms, then to give somebody something to alleviate the symptoms is close to impossible.
By the time a drug's approved and it hits the general population, we don't know even 50% of the side effects that are involved with that drug.
And these pills cause heart attacks and liver problems and immune system problems and lots of other medical problems. So you're playing with fire.
Every day, psychotropic drugs cause serious adverse reactions. And while psychiatrists and drug companies fully understand the dangers of the drugs they sell, their unsuspecting customers are left to suffer the consequences.
Everything became worse. Each mood swing was worse.
He would have chronic headaches, chronic, nausea, not feeling good.
She was very agitated, very, very jumpy.
She was having horrible hallucinations.
Her personality was disintegrating.
Once he started on that drug, the cloud just stayed over him and stayed over him and stayed over him. It got darker and darker.
He thought there wasn't anything worth living to kill himself. That was not Matthew. That was the drugs.
At least I would like to have said, I love you. I didn't get a chance to do that.
In addition to crippling scores of people daily, every month, psychiatric drugs kill an estimated 3,000. But the human devastation would never have gotten this high if psychiatrists hadn't worked hand in hand with drug companies to promote their drugs to doctors throughout the world. Today, 70% of all psychiatric drugs are prescribed by general physicians. And how was this accomplished? Marketing.
It's about creating a good story that uses science, that convinces a physician to think about writing a prescription.
This is not science. This is incredibly effective.
effective marketing has nothing to do with science.
They use what I call statistical contortionism. Basically just skew the numbers, make everything look fantastic, you hide the bad numbers.
They're learning every trick in the book. They're evolving into efficient marketing machines, and it's working.
There's definitely an unholy alliance between psychiatry and pharmaceutical sales. That's a marriage made in heaven.
They're like conjoined twins. They're joined at the wallet.
And with 374 mental disorders filling psychiatry's diagnostic manual, and more on the way, business is booming. Pharmaceutical companies have expanded their roster of psychotropic drugs from 44 in 1966 to 174 today. The top 5 psychotropic drugs combined gross more money than the gross national product of each of over half the countries on Earth. Altogether, the psychiatric industry rakes in $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. How could this have happened? It's a tale of deception that may be difficult to believe, but fatal to ignore.
We took him to a psychiatrist, and within a matter of minutes, yeah, she's ADHD, and here's your drug.
Went on the Medicaid, and 5 minutes later, he was on Zyprexa.
He saw the psychiatrist and prescribed the medicine for 20 minutes.
The guy didn't even look at her. He talked to her a little bit. Now, how can you tell if somebody's ADHD or not ADHD from just a few minutes talking to her?
Next thing I know, I'm getting handed a handful of Xanax. That's how easy it is to get these drugs. Just so easy. It's just passed to me like candy. That's simple.
If a person were to walk in off the street, sit down with a psychiatrist, the chances of him being prescribed a drug before he were to leave the office, I would have to put it at 100%.
Psychiatrists prescribe drugs. They might have different ways of diagnosing, they might have different ways of interacting with a patient, but it's rare to find a psychiatrist that uses no drugs.
The psychiatrists today are, in quotes, admitting they can't cure these mental illnesses, and they're therefore going to manage your illness by using a drug.
50 years ago, a person who was going through a divorce would have relied on family, friends, clergy, and even the family doctor to a certain extent for conversation to work through the issue. They certainly wouldn't have been medicated.
That was before the era of psychotropic drugs. Psychiatrists, occupying the lowest rung of the medical profession, worked almost exclusively in mental institutions. With no cures, there was little chance they would ever be respected by the public and their peers as real doctors.
Psychiatrists had for years been on the fringe of medicine. Typically, the standard doctor internist would have very low regard for psychiatrists because it was understood not to be a very clear science or art.
Psychiatrists wanted to be viewed as physicians, as doctors, and in order to be viewed as physicians and doctors, the people they dealt with had to be viewed as patients. And if doctors dealt with diseases, then their patients had to be diseased.
Psychiatrists had a wonderful opportunity, they felt, to become respected in the eyes of their peers. They raced to create a whole diagnostic book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was created by consensus.
A group of psychologists and psychiatrists get together, and if they have made common observations, they have a vote and they now classify a new disease. And they give it a number and it graduates into the DSM classification.
And it's a dangerous book. It's a book that has many disorders that could apply to any one of us, because the disorders are not real medical diseases. And it's things that apply to nearly all of us at times. Are you afraid of meeting new people? Are you afraid to speak in front of a large crowd of people? Does it make you nervous to go and to talk to your boss about a complaint?
You can invent a mental disorder based on a checklist of symptoms, and that is exactly how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the billing Bible for psychiatry, works.
Since the DSM's first edition in 1952, the number of diagnoses has steadily grown. from a slender 130-page booklet listing 106 so-called mental disorders, the DSM has bloated to a voluminous 886 pages. It is only through the use of this book that psychiatrists can diagnose, drug, and bill for services. In fact, the psychiatric industry currently uses the DSM to collect over $72 billion in private and government insurance money.
The DSM is used to diagnose and then give a label, and the label is used for billing purposes. That's how they get paid.
You have to have a term in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in order to then call it a disease and treat it as a disease and write a prescription for it.
And so because they can vote it in, they can create, and then the drug industry can just take over and market their drugs for those new disorders.
And those drugs were welcomed by psychiatry leaders because it made us real doctors.
Of course, first the public had to believe that there was something wrong with them, and that that thing wrong was biochemical, and that that could then be treated by a drug which was supposed to cure all.
And so it was relatively easy, I think, to say, well, look, let's start looking at mental illness as fundamentally a matter of chemical imbalance in the brain.
Chemical imbalance is a term that's used as a marketing ploy, as opposed to anything that there's scientific evidence to support.
Nobody has yet measured, demonstrated, or created a test to show that somebody has a chemical imbalance in their brain. Period.
How do you market a drug that restores the chemical balance or corrects a chemical imbalance? How can you do that in good conscience if you don't even know what one is?
The whole myth of the chemical imbalance was created to sell drugs.
And while psychiatrists and drug companies have used this myth to make billions moving vast quantities of psychotropic drugs into the bodies of unsuspecting consumers, the public has paid the ultimate price. An estimated half of all Americans who commit suicide are on psychotropic drugs. Annually, psychotropic drugs are estimated to kill more than 2.5 times more people than are killed by homicide. And who is entrusted with protecting the public against these dangerous psychotropic drugs? In the United States, it is the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, whose psychiatric drug advisory panels are dominated by psychiatrists who shuttle between the drug industry, academia, private practice, and government, the so-called revolving door.
The revolving door at FDA is one of the primary reasons why the system that we have works so poorly. That revolving door is a direct result of the fact that a group of people with the same mindset are put into positions of being regulators and in the position of being formulators and sellers and marketers.
The panels that are formed by the FDA to evaluate these drugs, the psychiatrists who are on those panels, almost all of them have conflicts of interest where they have directly or indirectly received funding from the very industry and the very parties within the industry whose drugs they are evaluating.
So there's this tight little relationship between psychiatry, pharmaceutical industry, and FDA where they each mutually support each other, and yet the mental health of the population does not improve.
Take, for example, the FDA drug evaluation panel that approved the antidepressant Paxil. Every psychiatrist on that panel has financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And these conflicts of interest have been rampant enough to prompt congressional investigation.
When I check these advisory committees who make recommendations to the FDA, and they're always approved after the advisory committee, I found that there were conflicts of interest. I found that many of the people on the advisory committees had never filed a proper report on stocks and bonds that they owned that might be viewed as a conflict of interest, and they're by law supposed to do that.
And this network of financial conflict of interest between psychiatry, the drug industry, and the FDA became even more entrenched in 1992, after passage of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, also known as PDUFA. Through this bill, the FDA would be paid a fee of $100,000 per drug to ensure that psychotropic medications would be rushed through the approval process and into the hands of prescribers faster than ever.
Congress told the FDA, your job is no longer to make sure drugs are squeaky clean safe before they get out on the market. Your job now is to hurry up and get new drugs on the market faster.
It acted to set the priorities of the FDA so that if there was a fee paid for a particular drug approval, it could be put on the fast track and rushed to market with less than the usual scrutiny that the FDA would give it.
And this fast track has traded safety for sales. Since the passage of PDUFA, time spent on drug evaluation plunged from almost 2 years in 1992 to only 6 months 4 years later. Meanwhile, the number of new drugs released to the public doubled. Though fast-tracking is disastrous for public safety, it reaps huge profits for psychiatry and the drug industry. Because the sooner a drug is approved, the sooner it makes money. And the money is big. Every day, the average psychotropic drug grosses over $7.7 million. One drug, Zyprexa, rakes in almost $12 million daily. And even though FDA now charges over $1 million per new drug application, the pharmaceutical fast track shows no signs of slowing.
If you look at the relationship between the FDA, the pharmaceutical industry, and the psychiatrists, there's some kind of game that they're playing there. And what is the game? Well, you could say it's money, definitely money.
And when you follow the money, you realize that there is no money in health. There's big money in disease.
That's why all you hear about is managing disease or treating disease. You don't really talk about curing disease.
And so psychiatrists have become mainstream doctors in America. And that is because of the pharmaceutical industry. They can thank the pharmaceutical industry because they become mainstream and because they have a lot more money than they used to. And the drug industry can thank them because now they have thousands of soldiers in their army distributing these drugs to everybody.
From the smallest infant to the oldest senior citizen, no one is immune from any of the hundreds of fictitious disorders invented by psychiatrists that fuel a multi-billion-dollar psychotropic drug industry. And every day, psychiatrists are casting their nets ever wider. And all it takes? Another psychiatric label.
How many people do you know who have been diagnosed with a mental disorder? One.
With a mental disorder? 2.
I'm sure a couple.
I know a few.
About 3 or 4 personally.
Probably 4.
Half a dozen?
I'll say about 9.
At least a dozen.
I'll bet I could count 15.
20 that I personally know.
My oldest son is diagnosed.
My mother was diagnosed.
Kid from my childhood.
My friend and ex-boyfriend.
Just my grandfather and cousins. A friend of mine, friends.
A sister, my neighbors.
2 friends. A girlfriend. A niece, 1 friend.
My mother.
All my friends, everybody I know.
An apparent flood of mental illness is all around us. Where is this coming from? Psychiatrists, whose diagnostic and statistical manual can label anyone walking the earth today as mentally ill.
Psychiatrists, I believe, they look at every human being and they divide humans into 2 classes, clients and potential clients.
We see this no more prevalent in any field than in the field of the mental disorders, where one disease after another is invented and then popularized and the public is made to worry about it.
It's a disease mongering. It's the selling of sickness. You know, sometimes it's a drug in search of a market, and it's giving public awareness to minor conditions with the ultimate goal is to sell more medications. It's not caring for people.
When you run out of symptoms, you don't have any more clientele to market to. So you have to invent disease. And with psychiatric medications, you can invent diseases all day long. Look at human variation.
Everyday things like shyness, sadness,
or even situational depressions like grieving, postpartum depression, they all become studied and prescriptions start to get written for these drugs.
Before these drugs were introduced in the market, people who had these conditions would not have been given any drug at all. And so it is the branding of a disease, and it is the branding of a drug for the treatment of a disease that did not exist before the industry made the disease.
Case in point, shyness, a common life situation, voted by psychiatrists into their diagnostic and statistical manual under the name social anxiety disorder.
You know, people are nervous. Well, they come up with, say, social anxiety disorder. SAD, they'll call it SAD.
And the connotation is that everybody ought to be happy and that here's a drug that can make you happy. So that a common occurrence, which is every now and again everybody's sad, we ought to be treating with a drug.
Well, then they'll get this PR firm to drum up business for this. They'll put out all these studies that find, you know, there's so many people afflicted with this SAD, you know, and they'll start putting it in magazines, they'll start putting it on TV, they'll start a patient advocacy group that say, you know, that we're all affected by this, and then they'll come out with Paxil works for this. So they go to the FDA and they said, well, we ran this study and this works for this new invented disorder. And that is SAD, social anxiety disorder. And millions of people suffer from it. And it's purely fictional. It's a normal human emotion that everybody experiences at certain times or another, but they make it into a disease.
Paxil, once it got approved by the FDA as the first antidepressant to be used for social anxiety, it took off huge. And it just moved from number 3 in the market amongst its peer drugs to number 1 in the market.
Social anxiety disorder is just one of many made-up psychiatric disorders fueling the boom in psychotropic drug prescription.
Psychiatrists work to promote what the latest disease is going to be. These days, bipolar is getting that same type of promotion.
Everybody's being educated about their bipolar illness, when in fact, we know having emotional ups and downs is distinctly human.
Now bipolar is thrown around like water. You've got bipolar, I have bipolar. I'm up today, I'm manic. If I go home tonight, I'm depressed because I'm tired, that shows I have bipolar disease. It's a lot of hokum.
Have you ever worried with seeing all the increased media on it that you might have a mental disorder?
Yes.
And which one is that?
I would say bipolar. You know, they talk about bipolar a lot.
Bipolar. I've known a lot of bipolar.
Two friends from both of them were like diagnosed with bipolar.
My neighbor, she was bipolar. I was diagnosed as bipolar.
My mother had bipolar.
He was actually bipolar. Schizophrenic bipolar. Bipolar and obsessive compulsive.
Bipolar and ADHD.
Bipolar disorder.
Bipolar, yeah.
Bipolar situation. Bipolar.
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 There are 3 personality disorders, and then the most recent is bipolar. And that's just been in the past year.
Spearheading the popularizing of bipolar disorder, especially in children, is psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Biederman, a paid speaker, advisor, and researcher for 25 different drug companies.
In 1996, the drug companies funneled all this money to this Dr. Biederman. He's well known. He's the one that came up and said that there's bipolar disorder in little kids. This was unheard of. There was no bipolar disorder in any kids. He came up with a study and published the articles out all over the world, and other doctors followed his lead that bipolar is in little kids.
Due to the constant promotion by Dr. Biederman and his colleagues, there has been a 4,000% increase of the diagnosis of bipolar in children since 1994, while the number of antipsychotics prescribed to them has leaped 5-fold to an estimated 2.5 million prescriptions. In 2008, Dr. Biederman was exposed by a Senate investigation for failing to report $1.6 million in personal income from pharmaceutical companies. But the damage had been done. Because of the bipolar fad created by Dr. Biederman, antipsychotics, some of the most powerful psychotropic drugs being prescribed, are psychiatry's drug of choice. The top 3 best-selling antipsychotics together gross $25,000 every minute. And no matter how big the psychotropic drug industry gets, psychiatrists are hard at work providing the diagnoses to make it even bigger.
Let's say this is the pie right here of a certain class of medications, and this is a pretty profitable pie and everybody wants a piece of that pie. But what would happen if we made that pie even bigger? And how you make the pie even bigger is by expanding the uses for those drugs.
They've already got a drug that's approved on the shelf. They can just pull it off the shelf, rename it, repackage it, and say, look, we've got a new drug for a new illness.
When Prozac's patent ran out, that Eli Lilly had to look for a new source of profits. So all they did was change the name of the drug from Prozac to Serafem, change the color of the pill from green to pink, and marketed it for PMDD, which is newly introduced into this book.
What it tells us is that if you can come up with a label, a diagnostic label for a drug, then you can sell it like hotcakes.
It's a business model, and it's $1 billion business model, and it works, and it's going to keep continuing.
Today, anyone may unknowingly be taking a psychiatric drug, renamed, repackaged, and prescribed for non-psychiatric purposes. Zyban, prescribed as a cure for smoking, is actually the antidepressant Wellbutrin. Cymbalta, a psychiatric drug for depression and anxiety, is now being marketed as Yentriv for urinary incontinence. Psychiatric researchers are testing psychotropic drugs on such wildly varying conditions as obesity, alcoholism, gambling, hot flashes, herpes, nausea, itching, shivering, and excessive hair pulling. It is a pill for every ill, and practically no one is being told how dangerous psychiatric drugs are.
As a chemist, I'm making these drugs. They're proving deadly in our labs, and they're proving deadly in other labs. Dangerous, ineffective, causing the exact same thing they're supposed to treat. How are they selling them?
For anyone who's given a label of a psychotic illness, drugs seem to be the automatic choice of treatments as night follows day.
That's all psychiatry does. It's dominated by psychopharmacologists who do nothing but manage symptoms by dispensing pills. That's it. And they don't work. But the fact that they don't work works to the advantage of the drug companies and the psychiatrists, which means that you're not cured, which means that you're a patient for life, you're a customer, you're a client for life. And the worse your health gets, the more drugs you need. It's a great deal for them.
We should all be up in arms about the way we're being treated by psychiatry today. This is a very dangerous industry that has gone so far overboard in inventing fictitious diseases and drugging our children and our population that I consider it to be engaged in crimes against humanity.
With over $80 billion a year in psychiatric drug money at stake, it is impossible to escape the saturation of psychiatric disease-mongering in today's society. But behind the marketing lurks a secret psychiatry's customers would be shocked to learn. How are these drugs tested? And are they safe?
Näitä lääkkeitä käytetään ikään kuin me tietäisimme, mitä niistä seuraa.
Mutta sitten toisaalta ne ei ole niin kuin vaarallisia eikä tuo niin kuin pitkäaikaista haittaa.
I have no doubt that they do more harm than good the way we use them.
Lähes 430 000 suomalaista syö erilaisia masennuslääkkeitä. Määrä on kasvanut rajusti parissa kymmenessä vuodessa. Lääkeannokset ovat entistä suurempia ja lääkkeitä syödään yhä pidempään. Masennusta pidettiin aiemmin sairautena, joka useimmissa tapauksissa paranee itsestään. Nyt yhä useamman sairaus jää pysyväksi ja johtaa työkyvyttömyyseläkkeelle. Joku tässä yhtälössä ei täsmää. Miksi ihmiset eivät parane, vaikka lääkkeitä syödään entistä enemmän?
On myös koulukunta, joka on sitä mieltä, että nimenomaan masennuslääkkeet altistaa masennuksen uusiutumiseen ja kroonistumiseen. Ne on ollut jo kauan olemassa. Niin jos he on oikeassa, niin tämä tilanne on erittäin outo.
Masentuneiden aivoissa on havaittu muutoksia erilaisin kuvaantamismenetelmin, mutta tämä ei päde kaikkiin ihmisiin. Masennusta ei edelleenkään voida diagnosoida verikokeella tai magneettikuvilla. Psykologi Aku Kopakkala kyseenalaistaa koko käsityksen masennuksesta aivosairautena.
Ei ole tapaa mitata oikeastaan ihmisestä mitenkään luonnontieteellisin menetelmin masennusta. Masennusta ei voida diagnosoida muuta kuin oikeastaan kysymällä ja havainnoimalla ihmistä.
Helsinkiläinen Ulla Tiitu sai masennusdiagnoosin vuonna 1994. Siitä alkoi 12 vuotta kestänyt lääkekokeilu, jonka aikana Tiitu söi 3 eri serotoniinin takaisinoton estäjää.
Siis kyllähän masennuslääke, kyllähän se piristää, mutta kyllähän siinä on aika doopattu olo. En mä toimintakykyä niistä ole koskaan saanut, siis noin, jos ajatellaan pidemmällä aikavälillä. Että jos ajattelee, että jos on masentunut ja ottaa jonkun napin, niin kyllähän sieltä nousee ylös. Mutta sitten kyllä hurahdetaan toiseen ääripäähän, eli mennään hypomanian puolelle sen jälkeen, jolloin se pitää käkkiä alas.
Joka ikinen sekunti aivosi vastaanottavat suuren määrän informaatiota ympäristöstäsi. Juuri nyt näet itsesi peilistä.
Tiitun saadessa ensimmäiset lääkkeensä 90-luvulla elettiin niin sanotun serotoniiniteorian kulta-aikaa. Teorian mukaan masennus johtuu aivoissa olevien välittäjäaineiden epätasapainosta.
Aikoinaan havaittiin, että oli tulehduslääkkeitä, joita syövät ihmiset pääsi masennuksesta. Sitten havaittiin, että nämä nimenomaiset lääkkeet lisäsivät serotoniinipitoisuutta aivoissa. Ja siitä syntyi sitten käsitys, että silloin masennus varmaankin on seurausta serotoniinin puutteesta. Se kuulostaa järkevältä, mutta samalla logiikalla voitaisiin ajatella, että ujous johtuu alkoholin puutteesta veressä, koska alkoholin lisääminen vereen taas vähentää ujoutta.
Masennuslääkkeiden ajateltiin korjaavan tätä epätasapainoa, koska ne lisäävät serotoniinin määrää aivoissa. Serotoniini virtaa hermosolujen välissä. Nimensä mukaisesti selektiiviset serotoniinin takaisinoton estäjät, eli SSRI-lääkkeet, estävät serotoniinin palautumisen hermosoluun.
Me haluttaisiin, että maailma olisi aika yksinkertainen, että siinä olisi serotoniinin puuta aivoissa ja lisätään serotoniinia, nopea fiksaus.
Serotoniinivajeesta ei ole löydetty tieteellistä näyttöä. Tämän myöntää jopa tunnettu masennuslääkkeiden puolesta puhuja, professori Erkki Isometsä.
No siis välittäjäainemuutoksia, jonkinlaisia poikkeavuuksiahan löydetään masennuspotilailta paljon, mutta tänä päivänä aika harva uskoo, että ne itsessään on kovin olennainen masennuksen syy.
Ja harvoja asioita on niin selkeästi osoitettu, että serotoniinin puutteesta aivoissa masennus ei johdu.
Silti usko serotoniiniteoriaan elää sitkeästi, jopa erittäin korkealla tasolla. Tässä Lontoossa sijaitsevassa rakennuksessa toimii Euroopan lääkevirasto. Virasto myöntää myös Suomessa myytävien lääkkeiden myyntiluvat. Ylilääkärin haastattelua seurasi 2 ylimääräistä tarkkailijaa.
Well, we know what they are doing. They are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and we have very good grip on what exactly they do in the human brain.
But has the theory of mechanism of action stayed the same for the last decades?
Yes, there has not much changed over the past decade.
Because what I've understood is that the so-called serotonin, lack of serotonin theories.
Yeah, it is a very old theory, but it is still around.
And that's the way they work.
Well, that is maybe in 10 years' time someone will know differently. But for today, this is the hypothesis under which we're working and based on which we're authorizing drugs.
Suomessa masennuksen hoidon korkein auktoriteetti on käypähoitosuositus. Suosituksen laatii työryhmä, jota johtaa professori Erkki Isometsä.
Kuinka turvallista näitä lääkkeitä on syödä, jos ei tiedetä, mikä se vaikutusmekanismi oikeastaan täsmälleen on?
No tässähän on ratkaisevaa aina se, että mitä kliiniset kokeet kertoo. Että ainahan meidän ymmärrys melkein minkä tahansa lääkkeen toimintamekanismista on epätäydellinen. Ja silloin tullaan näihin lumekontrolloituihin ja kaksoissokkoihin tutkimuksiin, jossa nimenomaan yritetään hyvin kriittisesti tislata se tieto ulos, että onko tällä lääkkeellä todellista vaikutusta vai ei.
Suuri hämmennyksen aihe minulle on itselleni ollut se, että kuinka väärä käsitys minulla oli aikoinaan siitä koko tässä lääketutkimuksesta ja mielen lääkehoidoista, koska jotenkin minäkin, vaikka mulla oli psykologin koulutus, niin oletin, että näitä on kovasti tutkittu ja sivuvaikutuksia on tutkittu.
Lääketutkimuksia tekevät lähinnä lääkeyhtiöt saadakseen uuden lääkkeen markkinoille. Lääketutkimukset ovat niin sanottuja kaksoissokkotutkimuksia, joissa puolet koehenkilöistä syö varsinaista lääkeainetta ja puolet placeboa eli lumelääkettä. Keskimäärin vajaa puolet varsinaista lääkettä syöneistä ja kolmannes lumelääkettä syöneistä saa lievitystä masennusoireisiinsa. Ero lumelääkkeen ja varsinaisen lääkkeen tehon välillä on vain 16–20%. Tästä saadaan niin sanottu numbers needed to treat -luku, joka kertoo kuinka monen ihmisen täytyy syödä lääkettä, jotta yksi saisi avun. Masennuslääkkeillä tämä luku on tyypillisesti 7.
So it's like 7 people need to be treated.
In order for one patient to get a meaningful response, yes.
Is this a good effect size in your opinion?
Well, what is good is in the eye of the beholder. Don't forget, we judge drugs based on the effect in groups. So, if you have two groups, one receives placebo, the other receives the active, and there is a meaningful and significant difference, and if the risks are acceptable, then we give it a license. That is at the group level. Now, if you are a patient and you ask yourself, do I want to receive a drug where the chance is 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 that I benefit? That is a question that needs to be resolved between the patient and the caregiver.
Masennuslääkkeistä on tehty niin sanottuja meta-analyysejä, joissa yhdistellään tilastollista dataa 10 tai jopa 100 eri lääketutkimuksista. Useat meta-analyysit ovat osoittaneet, että lievän ja keskivaikean masennuksen hoidossa lääkkeistä ei ole hyötyä. Brittien hoitosuositus ei suosita lääkkeitä lainkaan lievästä masennuksesta kärsiville. Suomen käypähoitosuosituksen mukaan masennuslääkkeitä säännöllisesti käyttävistä noin puolet toipuu oireettomiksi 6–8 viikossa.
Jos me arvioidaan niin kuin masennuslääkehoitoa ikään kuin terveydenhuollon kokonaisnäkökulmasta, niin ne olennaiset tiedot ei liity vain siihen, että kuinka tehokas on yksi masennuslääkehoitoyritys, vaan kuinka tehokasta masennuslääkehoito yleisesti ottaa, että kun ketjutetaan näitä hoitoyrityksiä, se on hirveän paljon suurempi kuin joku 50%.
Jos lääke ei tehoa, käypähoitosuositus kehottaa nostamaan lääkeannosta, vaihtamaan lääkettä tai kokeilemaan usean lääkkeen yhdistelmää. Lähes 1/3 potilaista tämäkään ei auta. Tällöin potilaalla todetaan niin sanottu lääkeresistentti masennus.
Miten voidaan erottaa potilaista ne, jotka hyötyvät lääkehoidosta?
Ei sitä etukäteen oikein voidakaan. Meillä ei ole hyviä ennustekijoita tällä hetkellä tiedossa.
Maailmalla masennuslääkkeiden tehosta on keskusteltu jo pitkään. Yksi näkyvimpiä kriitikoita on Nordic Cochrane Centerin johtaja, professori Peter Kötze. Cochrane on maailmanlaajuinen tutkimusverkosto, joka arvioi lääketieteellistä tutkimustietoa.
These drugs only work in severe depression, and even so they work very badly in severe depression. At most, 1 in 10 will benefit from them. So the vast majority of people who are treated with these patients don't get any benefit. But most of them get harmed, they get side effects.
Ulla Tiitulle masennuslääkkeet aiheuttivat levottomuutta ja maniaa. Diagnoosi vaihtui kaksisuuntaiseksi mielialahäiriöksi.
Siis sehän oli masennuslääkkeellä aina se, että sehän veti aina yli. Ja sitten myöhemmin tiedetäänkin, että sehän lisää mielialan heittelehtimistä, eli kiertoa, tämän tyyppinen lääkitys. Että tietysti jos mennään toiseen päähän yli, niin sittenhän se romahtaa sieltä alas taas voimakkaasti. Eli siitä saadaan sitten tämä jojo-ilmiö. Ja sitten tätä kutsutaan sairaudeksi, johon sitten laitetaan mielialan tasaaja ja ollaan sitä mieltä, että sitä pitää olla runsaasti, jotta tämä pysyisi hallinnassa.
When you give these drugs for some time, you actually induce new diseases that are worse than what you started out with. In about 10% of these patients, antidepressants cause a new disease which is now called bipolar.
Mä sanoisin masennuslääkkeistä sillä tavoin, että niiden haitat on pääsääntöisesti kiusallisia, mutta harvoin vaarallisia lääketieteellisessä mielessä. Et sellainen lievä pahoinvointi tai seksuaalinen haluttomuus, niin ne voi hyvinkin olla syitä, minkä takia ihminen ei halua käyttää masennuslääkettä, ja ymmärrä sen hyvin.
Isometsän johdolla laadittu masennuksen käypähoitosuositus ohjeistaa jatkamaan lääkehoitoa 0,5 vuoden ajan oireiden katoamisen jälkeen. Jos masennus uusiutuu 3. kerran, voidaan aloittaa ylläpitohoito eli jatkuva lääkitys.
Semmoisessa tilanteessa, jossa nämä on kohtalaisen vaikeita nämä masennusjaksot olleet, niin silloin on kyllä järkevää käyttää tämmöistä suojalääkitystä, tämmöistä ylläpitohoitoa. Ja sitä yleensä käytetään useiden vuosien ajan.
Very often abstinence symptoms or withdrawal symptoms are interpreted as a relapse of the disease. So isn't that deeply ironic that then you say these people still need the drugs when in fact you have caused harm in these people? It's terrible.
Suomi tottelee käypähoitosuositusta. Masennuslääkkeitä syödään entistä pidempään. MOT:n pyynnöstä Kelan tutkijat selvittivät, kuinka toistuvaa ja pitkäkestoista masennuslääkkeiden syönti on. Vuonna 2008 yli 260 000 ihmistä söi SSRI-lääkkeitä. Seuraavana vuonna näistä ihmisistä yli 180 000 söi edelleen samoja lääkkeitä. Vuodet vierivät ja lääkkeiden syönti jatkui. 5 vuotta myöhemmin lääkkeitä söi yhä yli 115 000 ihmistä, eli vajaa puolet alkuperäisestä joukosta. Lisäksi osa alkuperäisestä 260 000 ihmisestä söi myös muita yleisimpiä masennuslääkkeitä. Tämä joukko kasvoi 5 vuoden aikana. Yli 100 000 suomalaista on siis jatkuvalla masennuslääkityksellä.
Minusta se on kyllä huolestuttavaa. Me muutetaan siinä meidän niin kuin kehon toimintaa ja monia säätelyjärjestelmiä niin kuin isosti.
Onko tämmöinen yli 100 000 ihmisen joukko mielestäni semmoinen, joka tarvitsee sitä jatkuvaa ylläpitohoitoa?
Nyt tätä nimenomaista tutkimusta mä en tunne. Mä en uskalla mennä sitä kovin paljon sanomaan, mutta se on epidemiologisesti ottaen sen mittasuhteet luultavasti on vielä järkeviä.
Masennuslääkkeiden pitkäaikaisvaikutuksista on hyvin vähän tutkittua tietoa. Euroopan lääkevirastolle riittää 6 kuukautta.
We do not normally request studies longer than 6 months in the pre-licensing phase, for the reason that it is very difficult to do, patients drop out, then you don't know what to do with the trial data, and also there is the ethical issue of how long can you treat someone with placebo.
Lääketutkimukset mittaavat lääkkeen tehoa hyvin valikoidussa potilasryhmässä. Masennuslääketutkimuksiin ei yleensä huolita ihmisiä, joilla on itsetuhoisia taipumuksia, syömishäiriö, päihderiippuvuus tai joku muu mielenterveysongelma kuin masennus. Todellisessa maailmassa tällaisia ihmisiä on hyvin vähän.
Nämä tehdään rajatulla potilasjoukolla, jotka etsitään mahdollisimman sopivia potilaita, jotta saataisiin tietynlainen tulos aikaiseksi.
Vaikka lääkkeiden teho olisi osoitettu kliinisissä tutkimuksissa, tilanne käytännön terveydenhuollossa voi olla täysin toinen. Masennuslääkkeiden tehoa tavallisilla, vastaanotolla käyvillä potilailla on tutkittu varsin vähän. Yksi harvoista on amerikkalainen STAR-D-tutkimus, johon osallistui yli 4000 masennuspotilasta. Heille annettiin vuoden ajan parasta mahdollista lääkehoitoa. Vuoden päästä mukana olleista tutkimuspotilaista vain 108 oli täysin toipunut masennuksesta. Loput olivat joko jättäytyneet pois tutkimuksesta tai heidän masennuksensa oli uusiutunut.
STAR-D on tärkeä tutkimus, mutta siinä on hyvä huomata se, että millaisia oli ne potilaat, joita siihen valikoitu. Että oli siis varsin krooninen potilasryhmä. Ja kyllä tämä kroonisuus on sellainen tekijä, joka ilman muuta vaikuttaa odotettavissa oleviin hoitovasteisiin.
STAR-D-tutkimuksen tulokset herättivät keskustelua paitsi masennuslääkkeiden tehosta, myös paljon huolestuttavammasta asiasta. Entä jos masennuslääkkeet pitkällä aikavälillä muuttavat ihmisen aivokemiaa pysyvästi?
Koulukunta, mikä on vahvasti sitä mieltä, että masennuslääkkeet nimenomaan madaltaa kynnystä masennuksen uusiutumiseen, on kyllä saanut tästä käsitykselle vahvistusta.
A temporary problem becomes chronic because antidepressants change people. It changes their personality.
Mä en ole tästä asiasta samaa mieltä. Mun mielestä ei ole olemassa näyttöä siitä, että masennuslääkkeen käyttö lisäisi uusiutumisriskiä. Se on periaatteessa erittäin vakavasti otettava asia, jos tämmöinen riski on olemassa, mutta mun mielestä sellaista näyttöä ei ole.
Mielenterveyssyistä työkyvyttömyyseläkkeelle jääneiden määrä on kasvanut samaa tahtia lääkkeiden syönnin kanssa. Helsingin yliopiston tutkijat selvittivät, kuinka paljon masennuslääkkeitä syötiin ennen ja jälkeen eläköitymisen. Tulokset julkaistiin viime vuonna arvostetussa kansainvälisessä tiedelehdessä. Kehityskaari osoittaa, että juuri ennen masennuksen takia työkyvyttömyyseläkkeelle jäämistä masennuslääkkeiden kulutus kasvaa rajusti.
Tulee mieleen kyllä, että pahentaako sitä tilannetta, että syödään masennuslääkkeitä kovasti. Että ei se ainakaan asiaa paranna, koska nämä ihmiset epäilemättä ovat saaneet riittävän määrän lääkkeitä ennen sitä eläköitymistä. Että sen takia he eivät eläkkeelle jää, etteivät he olisi syöneet niitä. Mutta tämä antaa mahdollisuuden kahteen keskenään erilaiseen tulkintaan.
Onko tämä niin yksilötasolla niin, että on todennäköistä käyttää masennuslääkettä ennen kuin jää eläkkeelle vai?
Joo.
Joo. No sehän on ihan ilmeinen ja luonnollinen löydös, että eläkkeellehän pääsee oltuaan pitkään sairaslomalla masennuksen takia ja tyypillinen tilannehan on se, että hoitoon on hakeuduttu. Mehän on siis itsekin tätä tutkittu, että hoitoon hakeutuminen on tyypillisesti viivästynyt ja sitten siinä kun on oltu jo monta kuukautta toistaitoisia ja sairaslomalla, niin sitten lähdetään hoitamaan masennusta. Totta kai silloin siis masennuslääkkeitä ryhdytään käyttämään.
Ulla Tiitu jäi mielenterveysongelmiensa takia työkyvyttömyyseläkkeelle vuonna 2005. Tiitun mielestä hänet kirjaimellisesti lääkittiin eläkkeelle.
Se lääkemäärä oli sellainen, että kun mä en tunnistanut ympäristöä enkä mä havainnut asioita, niin mulla oli mieletön määrä pelkoja, enkä mä pystynyt olemaan yksin.
Neljä vuotta sitten Tiitu sai tarpeekseen. Hän lopetti tasaavien lääkkeiden käyttämisen. Serotoniinin takaisinoton estäjät hän oli lopettanut jo aiemmin vuonna 2006.
Mä pärjäsin itse asiassa koko ajan paremmin. Että se, että mä sain ajettua niitä pois, niin mun sosiaalinen elämä vilkastui. Sitten mä aloitin osapäiväisen työn ja mä rupesin olemaan elossa.
Käytetyimmät SSRI-lääkkeet Suomessa ovat sitalopraami ja essitalopraami, joiden yhteenlaskettu osuus masennuslääkkeiden kulutuksesta on noin 40%. Molempia lääkkeitä on myyty maailmanlaajuisesti 10 miljardeilla euroilla. Lääkkeiden valmistaja Lundbeck on turvautunut likaisiin keinoihin pitääkseen markkinat itsellään. Viime vuonna Euroopan komissio määräsi Lundbeckille lähes 94 miljoonan euron sakon. Lundbeck oli maksanut rinnakkaislääkkeiden valmistajille, jotta nämä eivät toisi markkinoille sitalopraamivalmiste Cipramilin kopioita.
The practices we are sanctioning are simply unacceptable. By today's decision, we are confirming that the so-called pay-for-delay deals constitute severe infringements of EU competition law. They may cause severe harm to patients and taxpayers and must be sanctioned accordingly.
Lundbeck on valittanut komission päätöksestä. Lundbeck toi sitalopraamin markkinoille vuonna 1993. Cipramil-nimellä myydyn lääkeaineen patentti umpeutui vuonna 2003. Samoihin aikoihin Lundbeck toi markkinoille uuden masennuslääkkeen Cipralexin. Cipralexin patentti umpeutuu Suomessa ensi kuussa. Markkinoille on tulossa jälleen uusi lääke nimeltä Brintellix. Cipramilin vaikuttavassa aineessa, sitalopraamissa, on 2 puoliskoa, jotka ovat toistensa peilikuvat. Toisella puoliskolla on vain vähän tai ei ollenkaan tehoa. Vain toinen puolisko on vaikuttava. Lundbeck erotti sitalopraamista tämän vaikuttavan aineen ja alkoi kutsua sitä uudella nimellä essitalopraami.
So it's the same substance. But our laws are so foolish that now you can patent the same substance just because you got rid of the inactive half. This is crazy, and it's even more crazy when we then see studies that claim that a drug is better than itself. I don't have much confidence in the studies like that because they are done by the company.
Suomessa lääkealan turvallisuus- ja kehittämiskeskus Fimea teki viime vuonna arviointikoosteen, jossa vertailtiin sitalopraamia ja essitalopraamia.
Näissä lääkkeissä sinänsä on kummassakin periaatteessa sama vaikuttava ainesosa, mutta toinen näistä on huomattavan paljon kalliimpi kuin toinen. Haluttiin selvittää se, että onko nyt kirjallisuudessa olevan näytön perusteella näiden hoitovaikutuksissa selkeitä eroja.
Peter Götze on analysoinut Lundbeckin lääketutkimusten raakadatan. Hänen mukaansa sitalopraamin ja essitalopraamin välillä ei ole eroa. Suomen lääkeviranomaiset ovat varovaisempia. Fimean arviointikoosteen perusteella kalliimpi lääke essitalopraami on hieman tehokkaampi 6-12 viikon hoidossa.
Se vaikuttaa siltä, että siinä se pieni ero olisi. No, mutta me ei tiedetä, että mitä tutkimuksia on jätetty julkaisematta, koska masennuslääketutkimuksesta noin 1/3 jätetään julkaisematta silloin, kun se tulos ei miellytä sitä tutkimuksen teettäjää.
Jotta lääke voisi saada myyntiluvan Euroopan lääkevirastolta, sen täytyy olla parempi kuin jo markkinoilla olevat lääkkeet. Tämän todistamiseksi riittää yksi vertaileva tutkimus.
Why did the escitalopram receive the marketing authorization?
I don't think we should go into specific drugs.
Haastattelupyyntöäni Lundbeckille palloteltiin viikkoja Tanskan pääkonttorin ja Suomen osaston välillä. Lopulta tavoitin Lundbeckin Suomen toimitusjohtajan Leif Jokisen ollessani vierailulla Euroopan lääkevirastossa. Miksei?
No, sinulla on mitään muuta syytä ja Lundbeck aina ollaan yhteistyötä. Me ollaan avoimia ja halutaan keskustella asioista.
Lundbeck lähetti vastauksensa sähköpostitse.
Sitalopraami ja essitalopraami ovat 2 toisistaan eroavaa lääkeainetta. Solu- ja molekyylitasolla näillä yhdisteillä on erilaiset ominaisuudet. Kliinisesti essitalopraami on sitalopraamia tehokkaampi masennuksen hoidossa.
No, millä perusteella lääkäri sitten voi valita, että kumpaa näistä valmisteista hän antaisi potilaalle?
No, lääkärin valmisteen valintaan tietysti vaikuttaa hyvin paljon käytettävissä oleva informaatio jota dominoi lääketeollisuuden markkinointi.
Suomen käypähoitosuositus listaa työryhmän jäsenten sidonnaisuudet lääkeyhtiöihin. Erkki Isometsä on osallistunut useiden lääkeyhtiöiden tilaisuuksiin ja saanut siitä palkkiota.
Kuinka paljon teille henkilökohtaisesti maksetaan lääkkeiden puolesta puhumisesta?
Siis mä en vuonna 2014 ole ollut minkäänlaisessa lääketeollisuuden tilaisuudessa puhumassa. En ollut sitä vuonna 2013kaan. Ja vuonna 2012 niin mä oon ollut pitämässä 2 luentoa lääketeollisuuden sponsaamassa tilaisuudessa. Mä vuodessa pidän 50-70 luentoa. Eli mä oon itse nostanut professoriliiton suosituksen mukaisen palkkion ihan asiallisesta ja pätevästä luennosta. Minusta tämä on oikeastaan vähän suoraan sanoen asiaton kysymys.
Yhdysvalloissa Lundbeck markkinoi essitalopraamia nimellä Lexapro. 10 vuotta sitten Lexapron markkinointistrategia vuoti julkisuuteen. Sen mukaan Lundbeckin kumppani Forest Laboratories maksoi Yhdysvaltain psykiatriyhdistykselle ja muutamalle muulle järjestölle, jotta ne laatisivat ohjeistuksen masennuksen hoitoon yhdessä Forestin kanssa.
No, that's a very interesting case. Lundbeck's partner in the States, Forest, had 19,000 doctors on their advisory board. Can you imagine that? 19,000. I mean, you don't need advice from 19,000 people. So, in my world, this is corruption. They buy these people.
This is Dr. Peter Bregan, and this is another in my Simple Truths about psychiatry. And the subject today is that psychiatric drugs are much, much more dangerous than you've ever been led to believe by the doctors who are prescribing them. I genuinely believe that if most people knew how dangerous the psychiatric drugs really were, most people would never start on them. And I also believe that if most prescribers had even the faintest idea how dangerous they were, they'd stop prescribing them. Well, how is it that so many people can be ignorant about psychiatric drugs? Well, the truth is because they're all getting their information from the drug companies. I mean, when was the last time you saw a car company leap up to tell people way in advance that they'd had some deaths on the road from their bad brakes? When was the last time car companies went mea culpa and said, yes, our accelerators are sticking and running people down? Well, I can tell you the drug companies are even worse. They go to all kinds of extremes to avoid letting you know and letting your doctor know how dangerous the drugs are. I know this because I've been a medical expert in dozens of lawsuits against drug companies. I've looked inside drug companies and seen what they're really doing. I was appointed by a court in Indiana to be the scientific expert for over 150 lawsuits against Eli Lilly, suits alleging that the drug Prozac had caused violence, suicide, mayhem, mania, and psychosis. So I know what goes inside. I know as much as anyone about how dangerous the drugs are. So let me just give you a little brief outline of material you can find in the first half of my book, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. Obviously, the second half is intended to help you come off psychiatric drugs, because it can be very dangerous to come off drugs. As dangerous and sometimes more than starting the drugs. Let's take a look at the stimulants that you may be taking as a college student or as a parent that you may be giving to your children. Follow-up studies on people who were started on stimulants as children show that they have shrinkage of brain tissue, measurable on brain scans. They have reduced height and weight. They're being incarcerated more often than other people. They're going to mental hospitals more often. Their suicide rate is increased. Every single one of these facts documented by follow-up studies of what happens to you if you get started on stimulants. And one particularly well-done study, the rate of cocaine abuse is greater when you become a young man or woman if you've been put on stimulants as a child. That's because the stimulant drugs, such as Ritalin and Concerta and Adderall and Dexedrine, they're so similar to cocaine in their effects. All right, let's look at another group, the sedative, sleeping pills that you're taking, like Sonata and Ambien, any one of the prescription sedatives used for sleep. We now got 2 or more good studies showing they shorten lifespan. You can Google them. You can Google practically anything I'm telling you, but you'll get more accurate and direct data from psychiatric drug withdrawal. Now, what about the benzodiazepines, the tranquilizers like Xanax and Valium and Ativan and Klonopin? They're very addictive. You know that people taking Xanax in controlled clinical trials, after a mere 6 weeks, a large percentage can't get off. After a mere 6 weeks, they become addicts to Xanax. Great for the drug business, great for your psychiatrist or prescriber who just wants to write prescriptions. Terrible for you. These drugs now, several studies show, like Xanax and Ativan, they're causing shrinkage of the brain too. Coming off them can be an absolute horror story. It can be harder to get off those drugs than to get off opiates. They leave people who try to come off of them with horrendous insomnia, horrendous anxiety, aches and pains in their body, such pain in their feet that they can't stand up, that it's just too much pain, weird feelings throughout their body, and then the realization as they come off that their minds aren't working as well, that they have memory loss for the past and have more trouble learning. Now, I know this is hard. You know, it's hard for me to even talk about it, but it's really time to face up to just how dangerous these drugs are. So we've looked at the stimulants and the sleeping pills and the benzos. Now the antipsychotic drugs, which are not really antipsychotic drugs, they're just lobotomizing drugs that are being given to some people for sleep, like Seroquel is being given to people for sleep, and Abilify and Latuda and Risperdal and Zyprexa. All of these drugs are very damaging to the brain. They virtually wreck a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. They cause a dreadful disorder, tardive dyskinesia. I've done a whole Simple Truth video about tardive dyskinesia. They're shortening the lifespan. We have evidence that people who are put on a lifetime dose of these antipsychotic drugs for whatever reason, whether it's to help you sleep at night or because that you're hallucinating and have a lot of problems, 20 years shortened lifespan. And we know some of the ways the lifespan is being shortened, because especially these newer antipsychotics, so-called second generation or atypical antipsychotics, they're even worse than the older ones in causing a metabolic syndrome. People get obese. They get diabetes. They get pancreatitis. They get elevated cholesterol. Blood pressure is off. And then, since the drugs also cause heart arrhythmias and in combination with other drugs do even more cardiovascular damage, that's one of the ways in which people are having shortened lifespan on these drugs. The mood stabilizers, so-called, which are just emotionally flattening drugs. Most of them were originally anti-seizure drugs. The one we've studied for the longest time is lithium. If you stay on lithium for a lifetime, like your doctor tells you to, you're at grave risk of severe mental problems in the form of memory difficulties, learning new materials, conducting your affairs like you have your whole life. None of these drugs are good for your brain All of these drugs are bad for your brain, and it shouldn't be any surprise. These drugs are producing multiple biochemical imbalances in brains that don't have any biochemical imbalance until a physician or prescriber puts you on the drug. Now, please don't just stop taking your drugs, because the ultimate tragedy is that coming off of them can be catastrophic. People can get suicidal, they can get violent. Some of the drugs, you can get seizures. Some of the drugs can drop your blood pressure if you're coming off. So, get good information. I put everything I know about it in psychiatric drug withdrawal. Get good information, get some good clinical supervision, work with your family or friends. The shorter time you're on psychiatric drugs almost certainly means that you'll have a better quality of life.